The late 1960s and early 1970s were a turning point for Japan as rapid industrialization led to severe environmental pollution. While the economy was booming, the country faced growing air and water contamination, threatening public health and natural ecosystems. The crisis sparked widespread concern, forcing the government to take action and shifting public attitudes toward environmental responsibility. Japan's industrial expansion came at a cost. Factories and power plants pumped sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides into the air, while untreated wastewater polluted rivers and coastal waters. With weak regulations and a focus on economic growth, environmental damage was largely ignored until it became impossible to overlook. The consequences were absolutely devastating. Air pollution triggered respiratory diseases like asthma and bronchitis, especially in cities. Water contamination led to infamous health disasters, such as Minamata disease caused by mercury poisoning and Itai-Itai disease linked to cadmium poisoning. These tragedies put a human face on the pollution crisis, fueling public outrage and demands for change. Beyond health impacts, pollution ravaged the environment. Acid rain damaged forests and farmland, while toxic waste wiped out fish populations, threatening local industries. As the crisis worsened, people took to the streets demanding stricter regulations and corporate accountability. After witnessing cities like Yokkaichi shrouded in a black smog, filmmaker Yoshimitsu Banno also saw the ocean being choked with foam from dumped detergent. Gradually, he began to formulate the story in his mind of an alien tadpole transforming into a monster as a result of the pollution. See, at this point in his career, Banno's most prolific job was working as an assistant director on Akira Kurosawa's samurai classic Throne of Blood. However, in 1970, Yoshimitsu Banno premiered his directorial debut, Japanese Nature and Dream. Toho producer Tomoyuki Tanaka was extremely impressed by the film and tasked Banno with bringing the Godzilla franchise back with a fresh new artistic voice. Banno pitched Godzilla vs. Hedora, a film that heavily centered around pollution and its effects on Japan as a nation. With the project greenlit, Haruo Nakajima returned to don the Godzilla suit, with franchise newcomer Kenpachiro Satsuma portraying Hedora. Satsuma would eventually go on to portray Godzilla throughout the entire Heisei era, so in a way, it's pretty neat seeing the Showa Godzilla suit actor battle the Heisei Godzilla suit actor on screen. Beyond the monsters, the humans would all be played by lesser-known actors in order to keep the budget down. Hiroyuki Kawase made his feature film debut as Ken, and he would later go on to appear in Godzilla vs. Megalon as an entirely different character. Beyond that, he would also act in various episodes of shows like Ultraman, Mirror Man, and Zone Fighter. Upon its release in Japanese cinemas, Godzilla vs. Hedora was torn apart by critics, who labeled the film as being too weird. The reason why the film was too weird was because Toho executive Tomoyuki Tanaka fell ill and was hospitalized. As a result, Tanaka wasn't able to monitor the production of Godzilla vs. Hedora, so director Yoshimitsu Banno took advantage of this creative freedom and was able to make the film as bizarre and experimental as he wanted. I think that's a big reason as to why I just adore this movie so much. This is an avant-garde filmmaker being given the reins of a massive franchise and doing whatever the hell he wants with full creative control. I would actually go as far as to say that this is my all-time favorite entry in the entire franchise. Yes, I'm dead serious. If you want to know why, well, let's get right into it. This is Godzilla vs. Hedora. Hedora, a monster born from industrial pollution, emerges, attacking oil tankers and spreading toxic sludge. Dr. Yano and his son Ken study the creature, discovering that it thrives on waste and evolves rapidly. Hedora grows from a tadpole-like aquatic form to a land-crawling stage, feeding on factory emissions. Godzilla arrives to confront it, but the smog monster survives and escapes, soon transforming into a flying form that spreads sulfuric acid mist, reducing entire cities to skeletal remains. Now an airborne terror, Hedora attacks Fuji City, killing thousands and rendering the air toxic. Godzilla battles it again, but Hedora proves nearly unstoppable, blinding him in one eye and burning his flesh with acidic sludge. Dr. Yano theorizes that dehydration is the key to stopping Hedora, and the Japanese Self-Defense Force sets up giant electrodes near Mount Fuji. In a final showdown, Hedora evolves into a towering humanoid form, overwhelming Godzilla until the electrodes are activated, though they fail until Godzilla powers them with his atomic breath. As the monster dries out, Godzilla ensures its destruction by tearing out its organs and incinerating them. With Hedora defeated, he marches away, leaving humanity to face the consequences of its pollution. But as the smog clears, an ominous final shot suggests that another Hedora could one day rise again. Even within the wildly unpredictable Showa era of Godzilla films, Godzilla vs. Hedora is in a category of its own. It is, without a doubt, the strangest, most experimental entry in the entire franchise. Yoshimitsu Banno took the creative freedom that he had to heart. He made a film that's part educational documentary, part environmental horror, part anti-pollution PSA, part psychedelic nightmare, and part children's kaiju adventure. The tonal whiplash of all of those ideas being blended together is not just noticeable, it's kind of the entire point of the film. One moment, a group of young people are dancing in a nightclub to a groovy anti-pollution anthem. The next, Hedora melts them into skeletons with its toxic sludge. The movie bombards you with surreal, almost cartoonish animated segments, hammering in the environmental message, only to shift into outright horror with Hedora's rampage. See, the film includes these really neat animated segments that act as interludes of sorts. They were animated by Etsuro Yasui, who sadly went uncredited. Regardless, the imagery of a man collapsing into a corroded husk as he inhales Hedora's fumes is something straight out of a grim sci-fi film like Soylent Green. It's not something you would expect to see in a movie where Godzilla later propels himself through the air like a rocket. Yes, that happens. Godzilla flies. He tucks his tail, fires his atomic breath at the ground, and takes off like a jet. It's one of the most absurd moments in the entire franchise, and yet, in the context of Godzilla vs. Hedora, it just works. Banno reportedly added the scene to provide some sense of levity because the rest of the film was so bleak, especially at that point in the film. And bleak it is. The destruction in this film feels more visceral than the standard kaiju fare. Hedora doesn't just knock down buildings, he suffocates people, poisons lakes, and leaves entire families dead in the streets. One scene in particular that stands out, as Hedora flies over a construction site, the building collapses, but there's no sound. It's completely silent. The absence of any noise, whether that be a technical error or intentional, makes the moment eerier than any explosion or monster roar ever could. The movie is filled with these weird dissonant choices that make it feel more like an avant-garde fever dream than a traditional Godzilla flick. The psychedelic elements are some of the most striking aspects of the entire film. From the animated sequences that really hammer home the dangers of pollution in an exaggerated, almost propaganda-type style, as well as this really interesting scene that takes place right before the third act. Feeling that the end is near, Yukio organizes a party for the youth at the top of Mount Fuji, in a final act of defiance against Hedora before it conquers all of Japan. The sequence of the youth traveling to Mount Fuji is very dark and brooding. It's in black and white. There's a clear sense of existential dread, and a feeling of doom. However, it quickly jumps to color as the party starts. It's very jarring, and a really creative sequence that lightens the tone. Hedora itself is one of the most horrifying kaiju in Godzilla's rogues gallery. Unlike most monsters, which just crush buildings and call it a day, Hedora represents something much more insidious. Pollution as an unstoppable mutating force. Its design is grotesque, constantly shifting between different forms, oozing and dripping with sludge. The effects work that brings Hedora to life is some of the most impressive of the Showa era. There are these really gross practical slime effects that make it feel so much more organic in a way that other monsters rarely do. Kenpachiro Satsuma, who played Hedora, reportedly suffered through filming while inside the suit, even having an emergency where his appendix had to be removed while wearing the suit. Since it took so long to take the suit on and off, he didn't have time. On top of that too, he apparently had problems with painkillers. They didn't have an effect on him. so they just had to cut him open while he's wearing this giant monster costume and remove his appendix. Now, I've heard conflicting evidence as to whether or not that last part is true, or if this is just a big urban legend, but regardless, if it is true, I think that alone makes him one of the toughest men to ever step foot in a kaiju suit. Godzilla's first scene is absolutely beautiful, with the warm and vibrant sunset in the background. While not the main focus of the film, Godzilla still has his show-stopping moments. The highlight for me has to be the final battle, which might be one of the most gruesome in franchise history. Godzilla gets severely burned, nearly drowns, and for the first time, he bleeds. While Godzilla vs. Gigan took gore to its extremes, Godzilla vs. Hedorah technically did it first. Reiichiro Manabe's score further adds to the film's off-kilter nature. It is unlike Ifukube's traditional Godzilla marches, opting instead for a warbling, almost off-key brass and jazz-infused melodies that feel completely alien to the franchise. It contributes to the dreamlike, sometimes nightmarish quality of the film. I know a lot of Godzilla fans might be reasonably upset that the iconic Ifukube score is largely absent, but I'm not exactly sure that his score would fit with this movie. The soundtrack to Godzilla vs. Hedorah can be extremely eerie at times. The track Ken's Cry always gives me the chills in a way that I really can't explain. However, a lot of that, I think, at least, has to do with how it's used in the film itself. You see, this is a movie that doesn't really hold back in terms of actually putting its child protagonist in harm's way, and I love it for that. At one point, Ken's arm gets severely burned, and I remember being shocked by that as a kid. It's incredibly rare to see a child actually get hurt like that in a movie aimed towards kids. Even then, there are several points in the film where Ken witnesses some genuinely traumatic stuff. It feels like a nightmare. He's surrounded by corpses. He witnesses his own father get brutally injured, but he never gives up hope due to Godzilla's presence. Throughout the series at this point, Godzilla has been leaning more towards that of a hero than a typical villain. Granted, this has been a gradual transition from movie to movie, but I really do think that this is the film where Godzilla actually becomes a hero with no strings attached. In Destroy All Monsters, he's still shown destroying cities. In Godzilla's Revenge, there's a somewhat horrifying scene where he tries to grab Ichiro. However, here, he really does take that big leap to being a hero, and I really like this direction that the character is going in. As we'll see later down the line with enemies like Gigan and Mechagodzilla, it allows for Godzilla to have a more threatening and versatile rogues gallery. But I'm getting too far ahead of myself to talk about Gigan or Mechagodzilla yet. Like Godzilla's Revenge, I have some questions about the world that this film is set in. I think most Godzilla fans would agree that this is set in the Showa continuity, obviously. But that continuity is already fairly vague and razor-thin as to what films are and aren't canon, but I always get confused by the fact that Ken plays with kaiju toys. On the surface, this wouldn't be too egregious, and as a kid, I loved it because it was like, oh wow, he's literally me. However, we can see that he owns a Godzilla toy, a King Ghidorah toy, a Baragon toy, and an Ultraman toy. Now, at this point, I can understand why Godzilla has his own toy. He's basically viewed as a superhero despite what happened in the first 4 films of the Showa era. But why the fuck does King Ghidorah have his own kid's toy? That would be the equivalence of Osama bin Laden having his own action figure for American children to play with. Seriously, consider how much destruction Ghidorah has caused in this universe so far. Remember, Destroy All Monsters hasn't even happened yet. Who had the bright idea of making a toy out of him? Beyond that, I have to wonder, to what extent does Ultraman exist in this universe? Is Ultraman just a TV show in this world too? Or is Ultraman real in this world? Like, does the Science Patrol exist? Now, I know this is nothing more than an Easter egg of sorts, but I think it unintentionally opened a can of worms. It's a can of worms that I don't even want to try and figure out right now, but it's honestly not that big of a deal, all things considered. This is a movie where Godzilla flies and a giant smog monster murders people. Like, it is what it is, man. I don't know. Speaking of Ultraman, Godzilla vs. Hedorah was released with Return of Ultraman as part of the Toho Champion Festival. For those that might be unaware, this was a film festival directed towards children in Japan. It started in 1969, with Godzilla's Revenge being the big headliner that year. 1970 saw the release of Space Amoeba, while 1971 was of course headlined by Godzilla vs. Hedorah. As time went on, Toho really pushed filmmakers helming the Godzilla films to make them with this child audience in mind. If you spend any amount of time with the Godzilla fandom, you'll likely hear people throw around the term festival films to describe the later Showa-era movies. This is why films like Godzilla vs. Megalon are labeled as such in a borderline derogatory way. So if you've ever wondered why the Showa-era flicks got to be so goofy, kid-friendly, and outright ridiculous, a lot of Godzilla fans will throw blame onto the Toho Champion Festival, for better or for worse. Looking at the international releases, in 1972 AIP released the film theatrically under the title Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster. Weirdly enough, hardly any fundamental changes were made to the movie, beyond removing Japanese text and replacing it with English text. Usually, Americanized releases of Godzilla movies have large chunks of the movie taken out, but here, that wasn't the case. Maybe it's because the dub supervisors just didn't care, or the film was outright too weird for them to make massive changes, so they left it as it is. Beyond that, a lot of the foreign titles were all sort of run-of-the-mill, with the exception being West Germany, who bafflingly titled it Frankenstein's Battle Against the Devil Monsters. I genuinely have no idea why they retitled every Godzilla movie to include Frankenstein in the title, beyond the monster having its roots in that country's culture. Though my favorite international title has to be Satan's Creature. That's from the Netherlands, and it's completely irrelevant to the actual movie, but I don't care. It kicks ass. Now, after completing the final cut of Godzilla vs. Hedorah, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka reportedly hated the film and vowed to never allow Yoshimitsu Banno to helm another Godzilla film for as long as he lives. In the late 2000s, Banno attempted to kickstart a new American remake of Godzilla titled Godzilla 3D to the Max. The film would have been a sequel to Godzilla vs. Hedorah, but it remained unmade. Banno would later be brought on by Legendary Pictures to produce the 2014 legendary Godzilla film. Yoshimitsu Banno passed away on May 7, 2017, at the age of 86. He would also be credited as an executive producer on every single MonsterVerse film after his death. So, without him, we wouldn't really have the MonsterVerse. Getting back to Godzilla vs. Hedorah, beyond just being a quality entry in the series, Godzilla vs. Hedorah has strongly influenced me as a filmmaker. The most obvious homage was in my second feature film, Pesticide. There's a scene where my character Angelo watches television and hallucinates. He sees a newsman wearing a latex fish mask, and this is a direct reference to the nightclub scene in Godzilla vs. Hedorah, where Yukio hallucinates and sees dancers wearing latex fish masks. It's safe to say that this film has always stuck with me, and it opened my eyes to avant-garde filmmaking at a very young age. So much of its abstract and horrific imagery is just burned into my brain. Should I have been watching this as a kid? In retrospect, probably not. I don't think it's a suitable film for children to watch, despite that being the intent. However, that doesn't detract from its quality. Godzilla vs. Hedorah is a film that took risks, and in my opinion, they totally paid off. In retrospect, I truly wish the franchise went in this weird off-kilter direction, rather than the more cookie-cutter, kid-friendly, schlocky entertainment angle that it took near the end of the Showa era. If anything, I wish more franchises would just give full creative control to artists like Yoshimitsu Banno, because, say what you want about this movie, it definitely isn't boring. With all that out of the way, I'm Cole McCormick. You're watching Firewood Media. This is just a very small part of my massive Godzilla retrospective project where I review every single Godzilla movie and TV show. I've already talked about the first 3 Godzilla installments in the MonsterVerse, plus Monarch Legacy of Monsters, so go check those out as well as our other Godzilla-centric videos on the channel. There's also some kaiju short films that are completely original that are here on the channel if you want to go check those out as well, like Restricted Zone and the feature film Anomalous Archives. If you like Godzilla, then they might be your jam. Consider becoming a member to support the channel. It's kind of like Patreon, but it's right here on YouTube. For just $1.99 a month, you could have seen this video way before it was made public. Also, we've got member shoutouts, so thank you to the members. They are right here on the screen. Thank you so much. And, like I mentioned, we make short films and feature films here on the channel. So, if you are a channel member, your name will be credited as an executive producer in all of our film projects. Yes, your name gets to be in the credits of a movie. Now, you don't have to if you don't want to, but it's an extra perk that can help the channel continue to make videos just like this. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.